All right, everybody, welcome back. This is the end of the world. Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu. And today we are bringing an amazing thing to you. That's right. It's our 2024 recap episode where we go over the year in apocalyptic thinking and happening.
Thinking and happening. Yes, that's right. That's well said.
Yeah. And we'll be going over, I think we have a list of about 5 topics we're going to touch on. This might be a bit shorter than our normal episode, though. I was talking with Michael just now, and I said, actually, I think it'll actually be longer. It'll be the longest episode.
Maybe.
But at the end of the episode, we will also turn our gazes forward. And in a change for the podcast, we will be looking forward with optimism. We'll be trying to discover what the best possible outcomes in 2025.
We'll be trying to discover if you could even fashion a decent scenario for 2025, I think is a better way of putting it.
No.
Which relatively is quite optimistic, especially for this podcast.
I'm seeing that Twitter image of the future city where people always share.
Right.
Yeah, that's
the train map that they always throw out, like.
Yeah.
Look how, what if we had trains? I love that one.
Oh, you mean like where there's like a corridor where you take it New York to Colorado, high-speed train.
Yeah, I could pop up to Toronto to see family in 38 minutes or whatever.
Yeah. Well, that'll never happen. So 2024, not a year, I will say that I began with a lot of optimism, but it somehow managed to be even worse than what I'd anticipated.
I would say substantially worse. I think the 2 big ones, obviously, and again, these are not to be ranked or in any order. It's all
this is just
but we start with like the biggest one in terms of the zeitgeist, and obviously Trump and
what J.R.R. Tolkien might term the return of the king. Donald Trump is back.
That's exactly right, and he's a good example of starting things without any optimism at all, but it being sort of even worse. I think we did sort of see this coming for a while, and then we kind of got hoodwinked by our own optimism. We
got optimism pilled at exactly the wrong moment.
That's right. But
I'm suing Ann Seltzer. I'm joining Trump's lawsuit because I blame her primarily for that.
But I think that like this one, like you're saying, that it turned out so much worse. There's something so much more devastating about him winning, I feel like, this time than the first time.
Oh, yeah, but also it's a weird double-edged thing, right? Because on the one hand, yes, it's much worse that Trump has obviously won again. That's horrible. But we've also been through it. So like the blow is dulled a little bit by the fact that we still have like the anti-venom in our system a little bit, or something. I'm mixing my metaphors here.
Maybe.
But, that was my experience. Like I remember, we talked about this at the time, like in 2016, early 17, I remember feeling just absolute despair in a way that now I'm just kind of like, God damn it, this is going to be awful. And I mean, we've had just in the last couple weeks, a few previews of that. And the thing that I guess, as bad as Biden ended up being on almost every conceivable level, the lack of chaos. There was something chaotic about Biden in that it was just unclear if he was like cogent or whatever. But the fact that Trump will just say things and kind of spontaneously scuttle whole diplomatic arrangements, I mean, we talked about it a little bit last week with the Canada stuff, right? Where it's like,
Canada, Greenland, and Panama are now in his sights, seemingly, right?
Yeah. And I mean, does he have the power to do anything about any of those issues? Probably not. But, 80% of Canada's exports go to the United States. So if Trump actually goes through with this, like, 25% tariff, Canada is good. It'll be like Great Depression for Canada. I mean, it's going to be wailing up and down the streets of Toronto. It's going to be
unless as he claims that if they do sort of fold themselves into the states, each business will double in size. and they'll pay 60% less in taxes. That's like not a bad argument if you can get it, right? I mean,
Right, but then
that's
does Canada just get one, like two senators? And
interesting question, right? That's an interesting question.
I mean, it's one thing if like Alberta joins the United States, something that Alberta would do in a heartbeat.
Right.
I
But
think.
it's funny, again, it's not to be, I guess, what's the way of looking at Trump? It's like, don't take him literally, but take him seriously. Isn't that what a lot of libs have always said?
Yeah, what a great way of thinking that is, as we know.
But the thing is that it does feel like, speaking about the apocalyptic and the sort of things that we talk about, it does feel a little bit like the beginning of a weird sort of sci-fi dystopian thing. It's like the new president gets in and sort of makes these territorial demands, right? Like the idea of sort of
Oh
bringing
yeah, yeah.
right? It does feel like
I mean, it's
are
like a new Roman emperor is in, and he's like, "All right,
yeah,
guys, we're gonna conquer Carpathia."
right,
You know,
right. Like, well, Margaret Atwood could, if she didn't, she easily could have written a book about a president who decided he actually wanted Canada to be part of 51st state or what have you.
yeah.
Long term, this is the sort of the big thing that I'm left with 2024 is some of the elements of the apocalypse or the complete sort of paradigm shift or decline of society, I think really sort of came to the forefront in a slightly different way this year. And this is a good example. It's not a huge reach to suggest that if we do move towards serious levels of climate disaster and scarcity,
This will be a big part of like
people have talked for a long time in Canada as well of like the threat eventually of America with oil and fresh water and resources and space and all of
and
that.
warming lands, right?
Yes,
like,
right. And
suddenly
so
that Yukon tundra doesn't look so.
That's right.
I'm starting to see condo units appearing on the horizon.
Right. And for all of it, in a sense, it's like, the more I think about the Trump stuff, it's in a way less insane than some of the stuff that he says. I mean, the Panama Canal thing, it just suggests that there's some awareness of a looming trade war, right?
Yep.
And Canada, a looming resource war, and whatever.
And Greenland, same thing, right?
Yes, exactly, right. And so, not to forget Greenland. But that's sort of the feeling I got about the year itself. In many different ways, was sort of that, like, the capacity for
resistance to these trends is lowering and lowering.
Is substantially lowering.
But we've seen some counter evidence to this. Like, have you been following the absolutely ludicrous right-wing civil war on Twitter this last week?
Yes, of course. This is the other side in terms of like what does any optimism look like for 2025 and what can Trump do or not do, is that there is this notion that the right wing suddenly had this very well-oiled machine in the run-up to the election, that Musk came on board. They started churning away with the algorithm and leaning into this anti-censorship thing and, actually attacking the Democrats seemingly pretty well from a politically strategic perspective. And they won. But the fact of the matter is, like, these people, in terms of the Musks and Viviks of this world, are substantially different than the constituents who they sided with in this election.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think it's also the case that, the Dems massively outspent the Republicans. They massively outraised them. They had a better ground game. None of it mattered because more than this being a sort of, I mean, yes, everyone tilted more to the right, even in states like Massachusetts and New York and places, but it wasn't because of anything that Republicans were doing, right? It was more a repudiation of what the Democrats hadn't done or had failed to do, right?
Yeah.
And now we're seeing that this coalition, as you say, is quite unstable. I mean, the visa war, seeing Musk just lose his mind about the visas, calling people racist, calling the MAGA, generic MAGA people the R slur. I mean,
no, I mean it's head spinning, right? He spent, how many days in the lead up to the election and just after it, posting like totally incorrect information, total misinformation about like migrant crime or migrant numbers with quotes like interesting. Like that was the whole tweet, right?
Yeah.
and now, less than 2 months after this thing, he's now confronted with, the reality of the thing that he has helped to create and foster, right?
And the people who he unbanned, I mean, it's hilarious to
Yeah.
see him just go on like a banning spree of all the
Yeah.
Groyper accounts. It's like, bro,
Right.
like,
And that's the interesting thing is like what's ahead for this battle where people like Musk, who run on this anti-censorship stuff and then censor whenever they need to, right? Like, how long can this alliance hold? Especially when, let's imagine that Doge can't actually, cut $2 trillion. Um, does this end up being like, for example, there are people already saying that any long-term political career or ambitions of someone like Vivek are basically out the window
oh
from
yeah,
this single post, right? Who this is a guy who was going to take a very substantial role, right, in a post-Trump MAGA world, and was sort of considered this guy who would have these debates with people, kind of,
right. But this is all predicated upon a very idiotic notion that MAGA people were not really racist, right?
Yeah,
I mean, they like believed their own propaganda about
that's
this.
right. That's
Like,
right.
no, that's just a slur from the woke mind virus.
Right.
And the funny thing now is that Musk is accusing racists of being woke,
Yes.
which is like, buddy, like,
And
what are we doing here, buddy?
I started seeing for the first time these people describing the woke right
Yeah.
online, and so it's hard to map out exactly how this
Well, you know
goes.
who's come really into their sights, so to speak, is Jordan Peterson's daughter.
Yes, I did follow this. Just catching strays.
She's just calling people woke, and then they're just transvestigating her. They're being like,
Yes.
"Oh, she's clearly a man and clearly
I
Jewish."
noticed. I saw Candace Owens be like, "Exactly what visa were you on here? How did you? How are you? How were you in this country?" Like, it's going to get very erratic and
Yeah, and that kind of brings it back to what I was saying, just that I had kind of to some extent forgotten the sheer amount of chaos, just kind of unpredictability. It's almost like dealing with an erratic toddler, right?
Yeah. Right, and it goes into, to go into the next topic, right? It kind of is this two sides of the same coin in terms of how heinous and despairing it all is. That, like, instead of this chaos, there's this accepted process that the Democrats can allow and foster in places like Gaza, right?
Yeah.
That when at the turn of the year, the feeling I think that a lot of people had was that there was some sense that this could not continue anything like in a long-term sense, right? That, we had been 3 months into this disaster.
What do you mean,
And
like last year, the end of
yeah,
last year?
that's right. And so I'm just saying in terms of like I had low expectations for 2024 and they went even worse.
Somehow much
I think
worse.
Gaza's at the top of the list. This true like banality of this process that has overtaken everything and left, I think, like criminalization of protest, just truly even at an electoral cost, refusing to back off funding this thing,
refusing to allow a single Palestinian speaker to even appear at the DNC.
Yes, and then just the expansion of this into a regional conflict
with the developments in Lebanon and now Syria.
With everybody. I mean, with everybody.
Iran. I mean, it's
right.
Yemen. And it's a nightmare.
It's terrible timing always, but it's interesting that something this bleak and dark and clearly wrong that needs to stop helps to foster this complete feeling of helplessness as everything else seems to be crumbling, right?
Yeah, and I mean, we have in both this country and in the UK where you just were, right? I mean,
Hmm.
In the UK, they have an ascendant for the moment Labour Party who are like our Democrats, just completely
Yep.
unwilling to be critical of Israel in any material way, and they've done that to themselves after using the fake anti-Semitism's smear against Corbyn in 19 and years following, right?
Hmm.
So now they're like vulnerable to their own like if they even point out what is like factually true. The other thing for me is just like the utter inability of the news media to cover this in anything resembling an objective fashion. Now,
Yeah.
I don't have an like post Watergate overinflated sense of the like profound moral good and clarity of the media or anything, but come on, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like when Abu Ghraib happened, for instance, the media was like, "This is bad," and yet everything seems to be filtered through the propaganda of the Israeli government,
Yeah.
and everything the Israeli government says is to just be accepted and not fact checked. Everything coming out of Gaza that isn't from the Israeli government is
Hmm.
treated as though it's a scurrilous lie. When the anecdotal material evidence we see on social media, painting an incredibly bleak,
Yeah.
just truly mind-numbingly
No.
disturbing picture of what's actually
And I think
occurring.
that 2024 ultimately is this profoundly disturbing example of what happens when an entire political body is basically has it beaten into it about what is possible and what is impossible.
Yeah.
Starting from something as small as taxation on the wealthy, right through to minimum wage and stimulus checks and
Healthcare.
Medicare for all,
Yeah.
climate change, and on and on and on to the point where when all of that possibility seems to be just eked out of anybody, that's when it helps to create a totally new bottom where things that you just even given how bad we have felt things have been going for a very long time, that something like this can be able to take place. And it's on top of all of these other things that are less immediate, obviously. But as I said before we came on to this, it's like it feels like we are turning a corner with something like climate change, where we're, if not already, it feels like 2025 it could be a moment where we start to learn about living with climate change, right? That we're going to eventually get to this point where the discussion is not going to be about the existential threat and totally empty idea of fixing things.
Yeah.
Instead, it's going to be how do we live with it to also protect our economic and personal resources and livelihoods
And I
and
think that's
lifestyle.
interesting because in a way we're moving away. The dominant metaphor for climate for the last 30 years, say, has been apocalypse, right?
Mm-hmm.
What we talk about every week in some form or another on this show. And there's a weird way in which we talk about when prophecy fails, when we were talking about the Waco cult, right? And like the Millerites. Like we're
Yeah.
getting to a point where it's like, oh, the like climate apocalypse we were sold hasn't happened. So in a weird way, like the apocalypse aspect of it kind of fades out. And
Yep.
instead it becomes, and I think this is related to Gaza, and I think this was related to the Iraq
It's
War when
related
that was
to
happening.
and
Right?
related to COVID.
And
It's
going
all
back,
of a piece. What you're
yeah,
describing is exactly right. Keep
that
going
there's
because I
like
think
that there's like this, you hit this point where, like you were just describing, let's call it a Gladwellian tipping point, if we will, as we must, where no longer are you seeing like hellfire and the end of
Mhm.
days, or in the case of COVID, just like piles and piles of bodies on the street in New York and things like this, right? Where it just becomes, you just kind of keep going, whether it's, all right, I put on my mask, I go to the subway, probably going to get COVID, I have to go to work, whatever, it's just like you make this compromise where in a way the apocalyptic overtones fade into the background. And then what you're left with is like the material reality of risk and death, right?
right, right.
And and it becomes
And I
like
think
an
yes.
actuarial calculation as opposed to a religious prophecy calculation,
Right.
right?
And you
Like,
do have this calculation that people make when they when they are very critical of people who are still hyper concerned about COVID, right? Which is like, I can't like not live my life,
Yeah,
right? Which
get over
I
it.
mean, which like I understand from the sense that like I basically operate like that, right?
Yep.
Like in my day to day, I'm constantly making this exchange to live whatever, pathetic normalcy I've decided is
Go to
important
the
enough
open mic, go
to.
to the movie
Yeah,
theater,
yeah,
whatever.
exactly. Like be with people and not like sit in my house thinking I'm going to get COVID. Like I know that that's the exchange that I'm making. And that's one of the things that I think the people in power ultimately realize is that, say what you want. And a lot of people can talk about how frustratingly meaningless the quotidian can feel, right?
Yep.
Going to some shitty job, doing some shitty, pointless thing, coming home and watching some shitty show and doing it all over again. That ultimately, like, it still has proven to be worth it enough for enough people, right? And in terms of the dynamic of normalizing these things, and we've talked about this a bit before, but I think that 2024, um, maybe in more ways than any year that I can really remember, um, has really started to show that we are in the process of living within a collapsing, if not likely, more likely already collapsed social structure in which, people with power and resources are starting to try to fill this vacuum that we are trying to understand what it looks like. Right. And COVID's a really good example of that because it's just like we said with the bird flu episode, it's like you can't assess it because ultimately it didn't actually, you know, go exactly as bad as in your disaster addled sort of the movies you've seen and the books and all the TV shows that we always talk about. It didn't go there, and it wasn't The Last of Us. So like, let's all move on. And that gives a lot of power to people, to allow for a lot of things to continue, seemingly in perpetuity. And I think that's where we're headed, is this shift into talking about these things as fait accompli, whether it's
Yeah.
climate change,
And I think
pandemic.
like we haven't talked about this in detail yet, but we will do an episode on this in 2025. But it reminds me a little bit of the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, right? Where when you hear the phrase fall of Roman Empire, at least when I was growing up, I pictured like, Conan the Barbarian, like chopping
Yes,
into a statue of Minerva or whatever.
of course.
But in point of fact, that's not what happened at all, right? The fall of, there were moments where barbarians came and wrecked stuff and stole gold and stuff, but really it's much more of what we're describing here. This like process of disintegration. It's
Mm.
almost like a process of entropy, where it's like little by little, and what you're describing about rich people kind of stepping in and being like, hey, I'm emperor now.
Yeah.
Whoa. Hey, that Goth army I control, they should go attack those Northumbrians or whatever,
Yeah.
like, and it just being this kind of free for all where some people are grabbing wealth, some people are grabbing the vestiges of power. And then eventually there comes a point when, oh, someone just realizes, wait, oh, the Roman empire's over.
Yeah.
We've had this Theodoric. He's been our king for a while. When did that happen? And
Mhm.
it just it's like this slow moving catastrophe, which is something we've talked about a lot, right? With climate change being the example par excellence of slow moving catastrophe. But what
Mhm.
I think we're starting to realize as we think about this more and more is that many of these other crises that we've been covering, that we've been talking about movies and films and shows and books about, also share this category, right? This like quality that
Yep.
they seem really disastrous, but like the actual insidious disaster is like a much more of a wasting sickness. And I
Exactly.
think like this is a good transition to our next topic, which is just something that I think in a similar way is going to have a similar like leeching effect on our society, and it's just the rise of the AI stuff that we saw in
Yep.
2024. Do you remember when you first encountered like an AI writing, like something written clearly written by AI?
No, actually, the my first main memory of like any discussion of AI was that New Yorker profile of Sam Altman, and
Okay.
that I forget what year that was, but that basically is where they suggested like how they were having to create an AI to fight against quote unquote sort of bad AI, right? And how a lot of these guys were buying nuclear bunkers and
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, islands and to prepare for this thing of AI and the battle that's going to be taking place between AI that serves humanity, and then of course like the paperclip theory, right? Um, that you can ask the AI to do something seemingly mundane, like make paperclips, and it could lead to the end of the world or what
Yep,
have you.
yep, yep.
That was like the first encounter, but the way I've sort of come I don't pretend to have any idea what is going to transpire with AI. The first feeling I get, and this could end up being wildly wrong, of course, but that many of the radical promises of the early days of the internet sort of serve as a similar example,
Yeah.
right? Which is that like there's going to be this open source ability, this democratization of scores of aspects of society. This new age, this renaissance sort of will come to pass. And of course, it got commodified, became basically run by advertising, and started looking a lot like we were living our entire lives on cable television,
That's right.
right? And
Within a
the things,
decade. I mean
and
that.
the things we got out of it were ultimately various levels of addiction, complete like rise in levels of depression and envy and all of that stuff.
Right, a heightened ability to communicate, but somehow alienation that arises from that heightened ability. Right?
That's right. Right. Like the feeling that this was going to create a brand new power for human voices obviously has not come to pass. I mean, if you look at
Well, if you were a powerful influencer, Michael, you might feel different.
right, but like if you could have at the beginning of the internet era been like, by the time this thing gets sophisticated, Donald Trump will have won two of the last three
and we'll all
presidencies.
know about someone called the Hawk Tuah girl or whatever, right?
Exactly. Who will have rug pulled for millions of dollars on a cryptocurrency
and then vanished.
Right. And so like that's how I sort of feel about AI. That like whatever is going to transpire,
It's probably going to follow that paradigm.
yeah. And of course, like at scale, the way that the internet has destroyed many traditional businesses and communities, you know,
Yeah.
what is AI going to do in that regard? Remains to be seen.
We're already seeing it. I mean, I think obviously it's going to have a deleterious effect on creative people, right?
Yes.
I mean, we're already seeing it in our own lives in small ways, be it with me getting AI assisted papers for my students that are all
That's right.
generic and bland in the same way, to the writing gigs that we might have once competed for being sopped up by AI, and or the drawing or art gigs that I might get. All just why hire Stu when you can just hire
an AI named Stu.
Yeah.
Right.
Feed all of Stu's Twitter profile images into an AI and just generate a Stu-esque image, right? I mean, that obviously no one is foolish enough to try such a thing, but because they're probably.
But isn't that like a very good example?
But
it's sort of a great example of what we're talking about, right? Just that we're staring directly at this thing that is taking place, that we know is going to have that and is already having that impact. And there's basically nothing that can be, the feeling is that there's nothing that can really be done about that.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, like it's going to be, I have in my notes here that it will primarily be a vehicle for and vector of especially creative immiseration as writers, artists, musicians become extraneous for lower to mid-level projects, right? Yeah. And like, that's like my whole thing. like I'm a writer, artist, and musician. I do all the stuff for this show, and it's like, why would someone ever hire me to do it for their show? Not that I'm like, advertising that, when they can just use ChatGPT and a variety of other services. Right. Like it's grim. And the other dark side of all this is it has that slow moving catastrophe. And it contributes to the other slow-moving catastrophe of climate change, because the energy usage to generate one, 9x12 image is like, what a house uses in a day. Like, it's just like.
There's also this other tragic element to it, right? Which is that like, if you start to sort of chip away at any creative avenues, not only obviously does it lead more people into poverty, but it also like mitigates the type of poverty or working class life of someone who wants to be expressive as an artist, that maybe forgoes the type of security, right, in order to like gets a few gigs, cobble something together, some sort of existence while like expressing themselves. And like that to me, if not purposeful, well, it's a really nice sort of trickle down effect for the power structure, right? That like these artistic communities will have it'll be even harder to be a
To have a voice. What's
right?
that? Yeah.
It will be harder to be like, yeah, you know what? I'm not gonna make a bunch of money. I'm not gonna have a 401k. I'm not gonna work some soulless job. I'm gonna, get the odd freelance gig while I'm working at a coffee shop and try to write something.
Yeah.
You can make fun of that, and people do mock that, but when that is gone, that is going to be a very, very sad.
Yeah, because then it's like, what is the point of this society if
What
it's
is the
like
point of this?
it's not enabling
And they
anyone's
like
creativity?
that idea. Like I think again, unwittingly or not,
Learn how to code. Remember their big mantra.
Or just like whatever.
Jokes on them. AI does all the coding now, but
there's no reason to try to be involved in, or no ability to get any type of ground floor creative experience. So you should like be a security guard who stands in front of a data server center or something, right? Like,
yeah.
And that to me is, again, on the list of all the things that we're talking about, obviously it is lower from an immediate perspective and people's basic humanity, but from a cultural perspective and a communal perspective, like that just seems to be one of the effects that AI, it's sort of looming. Right?
Yeah. And I mean, there was this big N+1 article in the most recent issue about Netflix and the sort of Netflix approach to creative process that is very much in line with this, just like destroying originality. It's just like none of that matters. We don't care about auteurism. We don't care about art at all. All we care about is gluing eyes to screens. And what's going to be the ultimate tool to enable that going forward? AI, right? And we've already seen it. And who is enabling it? Well, that's right. It's the rise of the new oligarchs. And as loath as I am to discuss him further, I think Elon Musk is, the poster boy for this moment, right? Of this kind of, I can't even really think of an exact historical moment where, well, I guess no one in history has ever really had the level of wealth that Musk now possesses. And that he's just inserted himself directly into the American political process when he's a very unserious person, right? I mean, he's not a thinker. And I don't particularly think Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos or really any of these other centibillionaires or whatever, people who have more than $100 billion, it doesn't seem like any of them are serious at thinking, and yet they have their hands around the neck of the world.
That's right.
And Trump, what can Trump do, right? I mean, you saw when this visa debate broke out, Trump sided with Musk. Mm-hmm. Trump says, I love these visas. I use them a lot at my golf clubs. And it's like, wait, what? He's like, I've got to bring in the finest Scottish caddies to my.
And speaking of 2025, which is how we sort of wanted to wrap up the podcast, this episode, is that like there's so much talk and obsession on the right of someone like Harris or Biden or whoever's the Democratic presidential candidate or president is ultimately this puppet, right? For these power structures that exist that they are unearthing but still maintain this mysteriousness, right? This truly
it's
evil
George Soros, right?
Right. This unfathomably evil string pulling that's going on. When in reality, there's just as strong an argument, right? That like what we're going to find out.
I would say a much stronger argument. Right?
Yeah, for all of Trump's bluster, that ultimately what purpose Trump is going to serve between now and the end of his term, right, is something of a, if not final, but significant transition to fully handing over power to Silicon Valley and these types of people.
Yeah.
And that starts with someone like Musk, but it's also something like Doge, right?
Yep.
You're going to see a ton of outsourcing of all this stuff to all these Silicon Valley startups, all these promises that are going to get made, that efficiency, disrupting. And bringing a sort of new era to centralized government under the guise of decentralizing, but of course, in fact, just
Well, just moving the money from
moving the money and
where
the
it's
power
controlled by
to somewhere
elected
else.
people to.
Right. Right. And what will be interesting to see probably starting this year, but definitely for the next 4 years, is that like, is there a lashing out moment in Trump? Right. That when it becomes more and more clear that this is what is going on, is he happy basically being Peter Thiel's bitch boy?
Yeah.
Right. Like, is that a satisfying way for him to go out? Who knows? But I think that the oligarchy that exists, right? The one that is imagined by the right, not that it doesn't exist in some ways,
Well, right.
right?
Not that the Democrats aren't equally beholden to rich donors, right? I mean,
Right,
clearly they are.
exactly. But essentially, what you're seeing, right, is that certain elements of the Silicon Valley group have decided that they're going all in on the Republican side, right? That
Yep.
they are going to try to make as best use of Trump as they can, and that I think will be essentially the defining story of American politics in the second term of Trump.
Yeah, and I think just to wrap up our 2024 discussion, I would just say like we essentially 2024 revealed that we had essentially learned nothing over the last 4 years, right? Or even worse, we learned the wrong thing. COVID, we learned nothing about COVID. We learned instead vaccine skepticism is an all-time high. People hate the idea of taking precautionary measures against pandemic illness. They will riot in the streets before doing another lockdown. They as new dangers appear, they are somehow taken less seriously than COVID-19 was. There's also just the way to combat the rise of sort of Trumpian right-wing demagoguery. Whatever strategies Democrats thought they had from 2020 were utterly ineffective. There was nothing was gained. Democrats have even lost the ability to push back on encroachments on civil rights for groups like trans people or those protesting what's happening in Gaza, people of Palestinian background. Right. Like whole identities are being criminalized. Yeah.
Part of their whole like the lessons learned from this year seem to be like, oh, we really can't be too loud in defending trans rights, for example.
Yeah.
It's just kind of getting in the way of our
certainly what the Matt Iglesias of the world want us to have learned.
It's disgusting. It's a complete, once again, a complete capitulation in this totally like false equivalency of like, how are we going to get back into power?
Where we will once again do nothing for 4 years, right?
Right. And again, like despite all the evidence actually being that, you didn't move far enough
the other
direction, right? That like, what their lesson was that they crushed Trump in 2020 when in fact he had been responsible for one of the worst handlings of a public health emergency imaginable, right? And the economy was destroyed and inflation, all that stuff, and they had to eke out a victory over 3 states by less than like 100,000 votes just to beat the guy even the second time.
Yep.
So like you can't like. The idea that they then came out of that being like, we're fine. We'll keep this guy.
This strategy works.
Right. We can keep Biden in office and basically not have him be the president, and that'll all be fine. And then
we'll just lie about it rampantly for
everyone's just so tired of Trump. We'll just run Harris and she'll win again. And it's like, if anything, we should have known that the results of the election in 2020 were a massive
anomaly.
Well, but also like an actual condemnation of the brand of the Democratic Party.
Yep.
That it could be that close in that moment has to tell you that the trust that the public has in you has eroded.
Right. And then even with the abortion Roe versus Wade being overturned, they were still, they were like, they eked out a kind of tie in 2022.
That's right.
And we thought that would just carry us back to victory in 2024, or they thought. I shouldn't identify myself too strongly with them. So what do we see coming for 2025? What are the best possible outcomes?
I mean, this is what I was saying before we came on, right? Which is like, is it possible to imagine a good year, like without feeling so delusional, right? other than to just suggest that things that probably won't happen somehow will, right? Like,
Sure.
obviously, as with many of these sort of moments in American and world history, it's that you have these people battling for very primary rights, the right to exist,
Hmm.
right? The right to not be slaughtered. Um, and so hopefully, of course, that should take, you know, that's the first problem that hopefully finally does get some sort of merciful ending to it. Um,
Yeah,
but
I mean, ending of the war in Gaza, ending of the war in Ukraine would be two things that would I would welcome in the new year.
yes, I mean, of course, but my again, like then, we're also talking about what are the consequences for
Yeah.
the act? Is it just they just finish them somehow? It's just like, oh, now it's over. They will get the right to take over more of the West Bank. Like, what are what I mean? Like, what are the actual ramifications for what has happened? And is there any way that you can like truly conceive that there will be an accounting for this, at least in the near future? It's very difficult. Um, in terms of the good things, like I do think that this confusion slash acrimony on the right
Hmm.
could at least blunt some of their political movements. Wouldn't you say that's like kind of maybe a
Yeah, I mean,
possibility?
I think what will happen is, Trump can't run again, so there's going to be a jockeying for to be, Vance is in the pole position for now, but
Mhm.
traditionally, as we've discovered with Harris, vice presidents do not have the best track record in trying to assume the mantle of their
Right.
predecessor. I mean, obviously, Bush Senior did it. Gore probably technically won, but didn't actually get to be president. Uh, Biden did win, but only after, the Hillary Trump disaster. So I think Vance is very much aligned with the Vivek, Peter Thiel,
Of
Musk
course.
wing of the party. And what we're seeing already is that the hardcore racist, xenophobic Laura Loomer sect
Mhm.
hates these people and is not going to get behind them. That creates a possibility for some kind of dissension in the ranks. I think there's a strong possibility of Trump, if not passing on, at least diminishing in capacity
Mhm.
massively in the next year. We've already seen a lot of signs of this. I mean, he did almost get shot twice. I
Yeah.
mean, he was almost killed twice, right? I mean, I don't know how much his heart is in this. And
Yeah, I
then
mean,
I
I think in
guess,
terms of
yeah,
like something that might be able to happen in 2025 would be some sign of a genuine, if not reorganization of the Democratic Party, a sign that like people can start thinking beyond like Pete Buttigieg is the best we might be able to
yeah.
do.
Or like Nancy Pelosi is no longer like controlling all the levers of power.
That's right.
Though
Right.
early indications are that's not going to happen. With you've seen what they've done. The Dems have put more geriatric people in leadership positions than
Yes.
ever. But it is hard to imagine um, something good coming in 2025. I don't feel particularly optimistic. But what horrors could you foresee,
Well,
like on the
I was
horizon?
thinking about this a little bit. You know, if I had to put like a guess on the table, it would be I feel like 2025 is going to be a bad year for like data, for like personal data. I what I mean by that is like I feel like do you remember like like that you'll get like the hacks, right? Like there was the one that like it turns out
Every
that
every
everyone's social
social
security
security
number.
number,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah. It feels like we're going to eventually get a moment where those stories that you hear, like that type of thing, like, oh
Hmm.
yeah, someone hacked all the credit cards ever used at Target or whatever. Remember that one? Like there's stuff like that. It feels like we're gonna get to a point where that has like very, very serious and visible real world
Where
ramifications.
there are people whose just like bank accounts are drained and they're screaming in the street,
Yes,
like,
that's right. That's right. Like I
yeah.
feel like we're on the cusp of something like that. I also feel like um I feel like when the next time we get like a big scheme or scam, like a Madoff type thing,
Yeah, and
I
Ron.
think I think it's going to be at a scale that we can't even sort of imagine
And we
yet.
sort of had
That-
that with FTX and some of these Bitcoin scams, right? I mean,
Yeah, I guess that's true, but I just feel like there's gotta be
like
something.
Amazon is like a Ponzi
Yeah,
scheme or something like that. Like something
yeah.
just truly
And
unfathomable.
it like what can transpire, could you have like a McDonald's going totally like bankrupt, like as a result of some massive scheme or money laundering or hacking operation, right? I don't know. This is not what I'm not particularly hoping for this, but it just feels
We're due for
like
something.
the cybersecurity. I don't know. It feels
I
like it's
like it. Yeah.
it's a bit of a guess. It's a bit of an out of left, taking a bit of a stab, but it feels like the more and more the potential is there for some truly, like, you're gonna wake up and you're gonna find out that there's like an open source like server that has every single text message ever sent by any human ever. And you could
Yeah.
just like go in and search it. You know what I
You
mean?
find
Like
all
something
your
like
ex's numbers. You're just like, she said,
that.
"What about me?" Oh my god.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's I
But the
like
one thing
that.
I do want to say for 2025 is
Yeah.
that until Pelosi does finally cede power
Or
move
pass on.
move on, shall we say,
Yeah.
I will. I promised my New Year's resolution is going to be that I will follow every Pelosi trade from here until when she's done, because we've lost basically our only chance at retirement. I
Yep.
think was to follow through on everything that she was doing, and I'm done not seizing that particular day.
Yeah, I like it. Well, 2024 was a fun year in as much as we started the podcast. And I've seen steady growth throughout the year.
It's been great.
December was our most successful month yet, which is nice. We had a bit of a lull over the summer, but then we've been a
Yeah.
steady juggernaut ever since then. And we've got a lot of fun things on the horizon, including next week.
Guests eventually.
Yeah, we're going to start having guests, not every week, but or maybe once a month. We'll see how it shakes out. And that is going to start, I think, hopefully the end of next month, maybe February, maybe for the 1 year anniversary of the pod.
Yeah, that might be nice.
But for our 50th episode, which is next week, we will be discussing a recent film that is, of course, Nosferatu.
Yes.
The famous German adaptation of Dracula, unauthorized. The recent remake has come out and has been getting rave reviews from my circles. People seem to love it. And we haven't talked about vampires as a sort of apocalyptic threat, or have we? Maybe they've come up in one or two things, but Frankenstein. We got Frankenstein out of the system early.
Sure.
It's time to visit the threat of Dracula. But in the meantime, if you like the show, you can follow us on Instagram at The End of the World WMS. You can rate or review the show on the podcatcher of your choice. And so we'll be back next week with Nosferatu. But until then, this has been The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu. And we will talk to you real soon.